Few films have ever asked this much of the world, or of the people who dared to make them. Filmed across 3 continents under temperatures that melted equipment and broke bodies, it stands as one of the most ambitious productions in cinema history. But behind the golden dunes and sweeping silhouettes lies a story most audiences never knew existed, one of chaos, desperation, and decisions made under impossible pressure. Lawrence of Arabia nearly didn't make it to the screen, and on the very night it was meant to dazzle the world, it almost didn't make it to the projector. Number 1. The print that almost killed premiere. The Royal World premiere was set for December 10, 1962, at the Odeon Leicester Square in London, one of the most anticipated film events of the year. Members of the royal family would be in attendance, the world's press was assembled, and producer Sam Spiegel had orchestrated every detail of the evening. But just days before the screening, disaster struck. One of the only existing 70mm prints was severely damaged in transit, leaving the production team facing an unthinkable situation. A desperate race began across continents to secure a replacement. The 70mm format was critical. The film had been shot specifically to fill the largest screens in the world, and no smaller print would do. Duplicating or transporting a 70mm print was no small feat in 1962, and the clock was ticking. The team coordinated international logistics in near total secrecy, determined to avoid any public hint that the premiere might be in jeopardy. The replacement print arrived just in time. The royal audience took their seats, the lights dimmed, and the evening proceeded as if nothing had happened. Nobody in that theater knew how close the night had come to collapse. For a film that had tested the limits of endurance at every stage of its creation, it was somehow fitting. Lawrence of Arabia had to fight its way to the projector one final time before it could be seen. Number 2. When Brando was meant to lead. The role of T.E. Lawrence was one of the most coveted and contested in Hollywood history. Before Peter O'Toole ever set foot in the desert, the production went through a turbulent casting process that could have produced a completely different film. Marlon Brando, the defining actor of his generation, was at one point in serious consideration for the lead, a prospect that fascinated and unsettled those closest to the project in equal measure. Albert Finney was the next major candidate, and his involvement went much further. He underwent extensive screen tests and came genuinely close to accepting the role before turning it down, reportedly unwilling to commit to the long-term contract that producer Sam Spiegel required. With 2 major stars having passed, the search continued until a relatively unknown stage actor named Peter O'Toole entered the picture. Director David Lean saw something in him that others had missed. What followed was one of the most transformative casting decisions in cinema history. O'Toole brought an otherworldly quality to Lawrence, something between charisma and fragility that a more established star might never have delivered. The uncertainty of the casting process, which had seemed like a crisis at the time, ultimately gave the film exactly the face it needed. Had the role gone elsewhere, it is difficult to imagine it achieving the same haunting power it carries to this day. Number 3. A lens built for one shot only. There are images in cinema that stop time, and few do it as completely as the moment a distant figure emerges from a shimmering heat haze in the middle of the desert. That single shot required a piece of equipment that simply didn't exist yet. Cinematographer Freddie Young worked with lens manufacturers to develop an extraordinarily long telephoto lens capable of compressing the desert's heat distortion into a single, coherent frame, built for this moment and almost nothing else. The technical challenge was enormous. Standard lenses couldn't capture the mirage effect at the distance required. The figure needed to appear as though materializing from the heat itself rather than simply walking toward the camera. The custom lens, one of the longest ever used on a film set at the time, allowed the camera to stay far enough back that the atmosphere between lens and subject did all the work. The result felt less like photography and more like hallucination. The shot became one of the most studied in film history, a masterclass in using technology to serve emotion rather than spectacle. It also reflected the film's deeper obsession with illusion and identity, a man appearing from nowhere, undefined and unknowable. That one extraordinary piece of glass helped define what the film was trying to say, and the gamble of building it for a single purpose paid off in one of cinema's most unforgettable entrances. Number 4. The writer they tried to erase. Behind the screenplay of one of cinema's most celebrated films lies a story of injustice that took decades to correct. The script that brought T.E. Lawrence's world to life was not written by one man alone, yet for years only one name appeared in the credits. Robert Bolt received sole screenwriting credit upon release, while the contributions of Michael Wilson, who had worked extensively on the script before Bolt's involvement, were completely erased from the record. Wilson's erasure was no accident. He had been blacklisted during the Hollywood Red Scare of the 1950s, a political witch hunt that destroyed careers and silenced voices across the industry. Despite his substantial work on the screenplay, his name was considered too controversial for a prestige production of this scale. The Writers Guild of America, which might have intervened, lacked jurisdiction over a British production, and so Wilson's contribution was buried. officially and deliberately. It took until 1995 for the wrong to be addressed, when the Writers Guild finally restored his credit. Wilson had passed away in 1978, never having received public acknowledgement for his work during his lifetime. The screenplay he helped shape went on to win awards and earn acclaim he never got to share. His name now appears alongside Bolt's, a quiet correction in the credits of a film that had, for too long, told only half the truth. Number 5. Camel riding nearly broke the cast. Nothing about performing in Lawrence of Arabia was comfortable, but few challenges came close to the physical ordeal of camel riding. Before filming began, cast members had to learn to mount, control, and spend hours atop animals that were unpredictable, uncooperative, and significantly taller than a horse. The learning curve was brutal. Muscles that no conventional training could prepare were tested daily, and injuries accumulated from the very first sessions. Peter O'Toole bore the brunt of it. Scenes requiring him to ride at speed across open desert were filmed repeatedly, and the camel's distinctive rocking gait inflicted a kind of punishment that left cast members struggling between takes. The pain was far from minor. Several actors developed serious saddle sores and muscle injuries that had to be managed throughout production. Some resorted to creative padding solutions just to survive long riding days without their discomfort showing on camera. The irony is visible in every frame. The riders on screen appear fluid and natural, as if born to the desert, the result of immense suffering carefully hidden from view. What looks effortless was anything but. The contrast between the film's graceful, sweeping visuals and the raw physical cost behind them is one of the great untold stories of the production. Every scene on Camelback came at a price, and the cast paid it take after take, mile after mile. Number 6. Feeding a film crew in the desert. Running a film set is one thing. Running one in the middle of the Jordanian desert, hours from the nearest town with hundreds of cast and crew requiring 3 meals a day, is something else entirely. The logistical operation behind keeping the production fed and hydrated was, in its own way, as remarkable as anything that appeared on screen. Water alone, in a region where temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, had to be imported in vast quantities and carefully rationed. Food supplies were transported across enormous distances by truck, often over terrain that barely qualified as road. Refrigeration in the field was primitive and unreliable, which meant menus were planned around what could survive the journey without spoiling. A dedicated catering team worked in conditions that mirrored the hardship of the cast, preparing meals in open desert heat while managing supply chains that stretched back to civilization. The sheer scale of the operation is easy to overlook when watching the finished film. But behind every sweeping shot was a small city's worth of people who needed to eat, drink, and function in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Producer Sam Spiegel's attention to his crew's welfare, where possible, was part of what kept morale high enough to survive a shoot that lasted well over a year. Feeding the desert production was itself an act of endurance. Number 7. A city flooded before filming began. Production was split across multiple countries, with Spain chosen for several key sequences. The area surrounding Seville became a base of operations, used to double for parts of the Middle East. But before filming could properly begin there, the region was struck by catastrophic flooding, one of the worst in years. Roads were destroyed, equipment was placed at risk, and the carefully planned schedule was thrown into disarray before a single frame had been shot in the country. The crew's response was to adapt without stopping. Production designers and location managers worked quickly to assess the damage and identify what could still be used. Some areas scouted for specific scenes were now inaccessible or completely transformed, requiring improvised alternatives to be found under pressure. The flooding didn't pause the production so much as force it to continuously reinvent itself against a changing landscape. There's a pattern running through the entire making of this film. Nature treated the production as an obstacle rather than a cooperative backdrop. The desert had already imposed brutal conditions in Jordan. Spain offered rain, floods, and logistical chaos in return. For the filmmakers, it was simply another test, one more challenge to be absorbed and worked around. The fact that none of it shows in the finished picture is a testament to how relentlessly the crew pushed forward. Number 8. The match cut that changed cinema. It lasts less than a second, but it may be the most studied edit in film history. A flame is extinguished, and the screen instantly fills with the blazing sun rising over the desert. The cut between the blown-out match and the sunrise over the dunes, used to bridge Lawrence's world in Cairo with the vast emptiness ahead of him, has been analyzed in film schools for decades. What most people don't know is that it wasn't part of the original plan. Editor Ann Coates discovered the cut during post-production, experimenting with ways to connect two completely different worlds in a single moment. The original intention had been a more conventional transition, but when she placed the two images together, something extraordinary emerged. The juxtaposition created meaning that neither image carried alone. It spoke instantly of scale, transformation, and the leap from the familiar into the unknown. David Lean recognized it immediately and didn't look back. The cut went on to influence generations of filmmakers, becoming a defining example of how editing can do what dialogue never could. It proved that the most powerful moments in cinema are sometimes the simplest, a choice made in a quiet editing room that changes everything. Anne Coates won the Academy Award for her work on the film, and this single transition is frequently cited as a central reason why. Some of cinema's greatest gifts arrive not in the shooting, but in the cutting. Number 9. Aqaba was built from nothing. When the script called for the assault on Aqaba, the production faced an immediate problem. The real city had changed beyond recognition since the events of World War I. The modern port bore no resemblance to the Ottoman-held town that T.E. Lawrence and his forces had taken by surprise. Rather than work around this, the decision was made to build the entire location from scratch, on the coast of southern Spain, near the town of Carboneras in Almeria. What followed was a construction project of remarkable ambition. Set designers and builders worked for months to erect a full-scale version of the town as it might have appeared in 1917, complete with period-accurate architecture, fortifications, and the level of detail required to survive close-up photography. The scale had to be convincing enough to anchor an assault sequence involving explosions, charging cavalry, and dozens of performers. Nothing could look temporary when the cameras rolled. The finished set was so persuasive that many viewers still assumed the Aqaba scenes were filmed somewhere in the Middle East. They were not. Every structure was placed by a construction crew in Spain, working from a designer's blueprint rather than historical record. It remains one of the great examples of production design manufacturing reality from nothing, turning empty coastline into a fully inhabited world. The illusion was total, and it was built entirely by hand. Number 10. How the Aqaba charge was staged. On screen, the charge on Aqaba reads as a vast military assault, hundreds of riders sweeping across open ground toward a fortified position. The scale, enormous, the chaos total. In reality, the sequence was achieved with a fraction of the forces it appears to depict. The number of horses, camels, and performers available to the production was limited, and the budget, however large, could not conjure an actual army. What it could do was put a skilled second unit team and a resourceful camera crew to work. By filming the same groups of riders from multiple angles at varying distances and speeds, the editing room was able to assemble a sequence that reads as far larger than it was. Carefully chosen camera positions made small clusters of riders appear to be part of an endless wave. Dust, motion, and cutting rhythm did the rest. The viewer's imagination supplied the scale that the production couldn't. The approach behind the Aqaba charge is a lesson in creative intelligence over raw resources. It demonstrated that spectacle is ultimately a perceptual experience, assembled in the mind of the audience rather than physically staged on the ground. Directors across multiple generations have cited the sequence as a masterclass in manufacturing illusion, and its techniques shaped the way battle scenes were constructed for years afterward. What looked like an army was, at its core, a very smart camera plan. Number 11. Spain blocked the camel handlers. The camels were there. That was never the problem. What Spain's authorities refused to allow was the entry of the professional handlers, the experienced camel men who had worked alongside the animals in Jordan and understood how to manage them on a film set. The reason came down to agricultural and livestock import regulations that drew no distinction between bringing in an animal and bringing in the people who knew how to work with it. The production suddenly found itself with camels, and no one qualified to handle them. The solution was improvisation under pressure. Local Spanish workers were recruited and given crash courses in camel handling, an animal almost none of them had encountered before. Working through translators and demonstration, the production team trained a new group of handlers in the basics of managing, directing, and calming the animals during filming. It was a far from ideal arrangement, but it moved forward because it had to. What emerged from this forced improvisation was, in some ways, a more authentic visual result than anyone had planned. The slight unpredictability of the animals, a product of handlers still learning their craft, gave certain scenes a rawness that rehearsed precision might have smoothed away. The obstacle became an accidental asset, and the camels, largely indifferent to the entire situation, continued to behave exactly as camels always do. Number 12. Sharif became the crew's translator. His role in the production extended well beyond his performance as Sheriff Ali. Born in Egypt and fluent in Arabic, Omar Sharif became an indispensable communication link between the English-speaking production team and the Arabic-speaking extras, local crew, and hired workers who formed a significant portion of the people on set. On a production operating across Jordan and other locations in the Arab world, that ability was not a minor convenience. It was a daily operational necessity. The communication challenges on set were constant and complex. Director David Lean needed instructions relayed quickly and accurately to large groups of extras who spoke no English, and the time lost to inadequate translation could cost an entire shooting day. Sharif stepped into the gap naturally, moving between languages and cultures with an ease that no one else on the production could match. His presence smoothed over countless potential flashpoints before they became real problems. It added a dimension to his involvement that has rarely been acknowledged in accounts of the film. He was not simply an actor waiting for his scenes. He was an active participant in the daily functioning of the production. The dual role he occupied, performer and communicator, made him one of the most valuable people on set, regardless of camera time. Without his ability to bridge two worlds, the shoot in Jordan would have been significantly more difficult to manage. Number 13. Moving cameras was a nightmare. The landscapes that make Lawrence of Arabia so visually overwhelming were also the landscapes that made filming it an engineering problem. Getting heavy 70mm camera equipment across soft sand, rocky desert, and terrain with no roads required solutions that simply didn't exist in any standard production handbook. Conventional vehicles couldn't manage the ground, and conventional rigging couldn't protect equipment from the fine sand particles that found their way into everything. The production developed a range of improvised solutions. Custom-built platforms were mounted on vehicles capable of handling desert terrain, allowing cameras to travel with the action rather than waiting for it. For static setups requiring precise placement, equipment was sometimes carried by hand across ground that no vehicle could navigate. The physical effort involved in placing a single camera for a single shot could take hours of preparation in conditions that simultaneously threatened to damage the equipment being transported. Cinematographer Freddie Young later described the physical challenge of desert filmmaking as something no studio background could prepare a crew for. Every visual decision came with a logistical price. The extraordinary compositions that defined the film's visual language were earned through sweat and improvisation in equal measure, each one the result of people carrying impossibly heavy things across terrain that resisted every step. The camera positions that look inevitable on screen were anything but in practice. Number 14. A fingerprint hidden in the film. What the desert couldn't do to the people on screen, it did to the film itself. When restoration teams began their painstaking work on the original elements decades later, they discovered something unexpected embedded in the image: physical marks left by extreme heat on the celluloid. The desert had, quite literally, burned its presence into the footage. These heat-induced imperfections appeared as irregularities in the emulsion, subtle but unmistakable to trained eyes. Film stock of that era was sensitive to temperature in ways that modern materials are not. Prolonged exposure to the intense Jordanian heat caused expansion and warping at a microscopic level, changes invisible to cinema audiences, but clearly detectable under restoration analysis. The damage was not uniform. It varied depending on how long specific reels had been stored in the field, how they had been transported, and whether they had been exposed to direct sunlight during handling. Each reel told its own environmental story. The discovery gave restoration teams an unexpected form of documentation, evidence of where the footage had been and what conditions it had endured. Some described it as the desert leaving a fingerprint on the film, a record not of what the camera captured, but of what the location did to the raw material itself. It is one of the stranger forms of authenticity in cinema, proof written into the image that the landscapes shown on screen were not fabricated. The desert was real, and the film remembers it. Number 15. The film was cut after release. At its world premiere, the picture ran for approximately 227 minutes, nearly 4 hours, with an intermission built into the experience. Audiences and critics responded with extraordinary praise, and the film went on to win 7 Academy Awards. But within months of release, a significant portion of that runtime disappeared. Approximately 20 minutes were cut before wider distribution, a decision made not by David Lean, but by the studio responding to commercial pressures. The cuts altered the film in ways that would not be fully understood for decades. Entire scenes were removed, character moments lost, and the pacing of the second half shifted in ways that diminished its complexity. For years, the shortened version was the only one most audiences ever saw, and many had no idea that what they were watching was incomplete. The original negative had been physically cut as well, meaning the missing material wasn't simply sitting in a vault waiting to be retrieved. A major restoration effort in the late 1980s, led by director Steven Spielberg and producer Robert Harris, worked to reconstruct the original version as closely as possible. Missing footage was located from multiple sources, some in poor condition. The restored version, released in 1989, came remarkably close to what had premiered in 1962, but recovering it took years of detective work and painstaking reconstruction. The film that almost everyone thought they knew had been quietly incomplete for over 2 decades. Number 16. They shot enough for another film. The cameras rolled for well over a year across Jordan, Spain, and Morocco, and during that time, an extraordinary volume of footage accumulated. By the time principal photography wrapped, the production had generated enough raw material to film multiple features. Estimates suggest that the ratio of shot footage to finished film was enormous, even by the standards of a large-scale production, a consequence of David Lean's perfectionism, the complexity of desert logistics, and the simple fact that when something went wrong in the field, it was rarely quick to fix. The editing process was therefore not just a matter of selection, it was an act of radical reduction. Editor Ann Coates faced the challenge of distilling months of footage into a coherent narrative, making decisions that would shape the film's identity as much as anything that happened on location. Entire sequences that had taken days to shoot were set aside. Character scenes that provided texture and context were trimmed or removed entirely in the interest of pace and focus. The result was a film that carries within it the ghost of several versions that never existed. What ended up on screen was not the only story the footage could have told. It was the one that survived the editing room. The discipline required to reduce that volume of material into something this focused was itself a creative achievement. Lean's instinct for what to keep proved as important as his instinct for what to film in the first place. Number 17. The score was written under pressure. Few pieces of film music are as instantly recognizable or as deceptively simple as the theme Maurice Jarre composed for this production. What sounds like the inevitable accompaniment to desert grandeur was written under extraordinary time pressure. The composer originally attached to the project, William Walton, withdrew late in the process, leaving the film without a score at a critical stage. Jarre, a relatively little-known French composer at the time, was brought in as a replacement with an almost impossibly tight deadline. He completed the entire score in approximately 6 weeks, a time frame that would be considered challenging for a modest production, let alone one of this scale. Working with limited preparation time and under pressure from both the studio and the production team, Jarre composed music that had to serve some of the largest images ever committed to film. The main theme, built around the evocative sound of the lute and sweeping orchestration, was written quickly and almost intuitively. The Academy rewarded what pressure produced. Jarre won the Oscar for Best Original Score, his first for work completed in a fraction of the time his predecessor would have had. The irony is that urgency may have worked in the film's favor. A longer gestation might have produced something more considered, but less visceral. What Jarre delivered in 6 weeks went on to become one of the most recognized pieces of film music ever written, hummed by people who have never seen the film. Number 18. The sunrise took multiple attempts. Some of the most beautiful images in cinema are also the most expensive to capture, not in budget, but in time. The famous desert sunrise sequence, in which the horizon slowly bleeds from darkness into blazing color, required the crew to be in position before dawn, fully prepared, waiting for conditions that could not be manufactured or controlled. The sun rises exactly once each morning, and the window for a usable shot was measured in minutes. The first attempt failed, then another. Cloud cover, atmospheric haze, incorrect positioning, and the unpredictability of natural light conspired to deny the crew the precise image Lean had envisioned. The entire operation, moving equipment, placing performers, preparing the camera, had to be repeated from scratch each time. In a desert environment, setting up before first light meant working in cold darkness, then waiting in silence as the temperature began its rapid climb toward the day's extreme heat. The patience required was significant, and the costs in time and crew effort were real. But the shot that eventually emerged from those repeated attempts became one of the defining images of the film. A sunrise so precisely composed that it looks almost artificial in its perfection. The natural world, after several refusals, finally delivered exactly what the director had imagined. It is a reminder that the most breathtaking natural images in film are rarely accidents. They are the product of extraordinary persistence. Number 19. Lean never saw it properly. The sequence in which a film is assembled during post-production is rarely neat, and for a project of this complexity, it was especially chaotic. By the time the royal premiere arrived, director David Lean had not experienced the picture as a continuous whole in anything resembling proper viewing conditions. The editing process had been intense and fragmented, reels reviewed in isolation, sequences assessed out of context, adjustments made right up to the final days before the screening. What this meant in practice was that Lean walked into one of the most prestigious film premieres in history without the certainty that usually accompanies a finished work. He had seen the parts, scrutinized them obsessively, but the experience of the complete film, assembled and projected at full scale with its score intact, was in some meaningful sense new to him as well. The premiere was, for its own director, partly a first viewing. The tension this created was real. A filmmaker of Lean's precision and perfectionism, unable to verify the final product under proper conditions before it was seen by royalty, press, and the public simultaneously, was a nerve-wracking position by any measure. The film delivered regardless. The response was immediate and overwhelming. But the story behind the premiere is one of a director trusting a process he hadn't fully witnessed, releasing a vision into the world before he had entirely seen it himself. Number 20. A sound trick that seemed wrong. Sound design in 1962 operated under a set of conventions that audiences had largely internalized without knowing it. Certain silences, certain balances between music and effect, certain approaches to ambient sound had become invisible through repetition. The sound team working on this production chose to challenge some of those conventions deliberately, using silence and spatial contrast in ways that felt, to early audiences, not bold but broken. The most notable reaction came during sequences in which the expected ambient sound of the desert, wind, the movement of animals, the sounds of a crowd, was reduced or absent in ways that defied expectation. Some preview audiences assumed these moments were technical errors. The sensation of a vast space rendered in near silence felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, more like a fault in projection than an artistic decision. Initial screenings drew confused responses from those who encountered it first. In time, those same choices came to be understood as among the film's most sophisticated achievements. The deliberate use of audio contrast, the sudden weight of silence against the enormity of the visual, became a technique studied alongside the match cut and the mirage shot as evidence of a production working at the absolute edge of what cinema could do. What audiences initially heard as a mistake was, in the end, one of the most precise decisions the film ever made. Sometimes the most advanced creative choices are simply ahead of their moment. Number 21. The film sparked political backlash. A production of this scale, depicting real historical events in a region with deep and unresolved political tensions, was never going to pass without controversy. Upon release, Lawrence of Arabia faced criticism from multiple directions. Arab audiences and commentators objected to the way their history had been interpreted through a Western lens, while others took issue with specific portrayals of Arab leaders and tribal figures. The film's perspective was unmistakably that of a European observer, and that framing did not go unnoticed. Several Arab countries restricted or outright banned the film, citing concerns about its characterization of Arab peoples and its romanticized treatment of a British military figure operating in their lands. The criticism was not uniform, responses varied significantly from country to country, but the underlying tension was consistent. A Hollywood production, however prestigious, had claimed authority over a chapter of history that belonged to others. The question of who gets to tell which stories was rarely asked as loudly in 1962 as it is today, but it was being asked. The controversy never significantly damaged the film's standing in Western critical circles, where it was received as a masterpiece virtually from the moment of release. But it did ensure that its legacy remained complicated in the regions it depicted. Decades later, those questions of representation and perspective have only grown more relevant. The film endures as a work of extraordinary craft, and as a reminder that a camera pointed at someone else's history always carries a point of view, whether its makers intended one or not. Number 22. A casting choice that aged poorly. There is much in the film that invites admiration without reservation, and then there is the casting of several Arab roles. At a time when Hollywood rarely considered authenticity of representation a production priority, non-Arab actors were placed in prominent roles depicting Arab characters. The most discussed example involves Alec Guinness portraying Prince Faisal, a central historical figure, a performance delivered entirely through prosthetics, costuming, and studied mannerism by a British actor with no connection to the culture he was depicting. At the time of release, this raised few eyebrows in mainstream Western criticism. Guinness was a celebrated actor, the performance was considered skillful, and the practice of casting across ethnicity was standard industry behavior rather than a recognized problem. The film was not unusual in this regard. It was entirely typical of its era. That context is important, but it does not resolve the discomfort that modern audiences increasingly bring to those scenes. The shift in perspective has been significant enough that the casting is now routinely raised whenever the film is discussed in depth. It sits alongside the film's other complexities, its Eurocentric viewpoint, its framing of Arab agency, as part of an honest accounting of what the production chose to do and why. Acknowledging it diminishes nothing of the film's technical achievement, while allowing a fuller picture of the assumptions embedded in its making. A great film and an uncomfortable legacy are not mutually exclusive, and sitting with both is part of engaging with cinema honestly. Number 23. Lean's voice, Bolt's real cameo. For years, a persistent piece of trivia circulated among film enthusiasts that director David Lean had appeared in his own film. The claim is almost true, but not in the way most people assume. Lean did contribute to the film as a performer, but not visibly. His is the voice heard giving the command during the motorcycle scene near the opening, a brief functional piece of audio work that placed the director inside the picture without ever putting him on screen. The more interesting story belongs to screenwriter Robert Bolt, who actually does appear in the film in a small visible role. Bolt can be spotted as one of the characters in the background of a Cairo scene, a quiet insertion that connected the man who wrote the words to the world those words created. It was the kind of in-joke that production insiders appreciated and general audiences had no way of detecting without being told. The confusion between the two contributions has persisted for decades, with Lean's name attached to a visual cameo he never actually made. The reality, a director's voice hidden in an early scene, a writer's face hidden in a crowd, is somehow more interesting than the myth. Both men left traces of themselves in the film, but in characteristically different ways. One through language, reduced to a single spoken command, and the other through presence, quietly watching the world his words had helped build. Now that you know, try finding them. Number 24. Restoring a film with no blueprint. When the decision was made in the late 1980s to restore the film to something close to its original form, the team quickly discovered that the path forward was anything but clear. The original negative had been physically cut to create the shortened theatrical version, meaning that the material removed from distribution had not simply been stored away, it had been separated, mislabeled, and in some cases lost entirely within the studio archive system. Reconstruction would require finding pieces that no one had systematically tracked for over 20 years. The restoration team, working under producer Robert Harris and with the involvement of director Steven Spielberg, functioned less like technicians and more like investigators. Print elements were sourced from multiple countries. Different markets had received slightly different versions, and cross-referencing them helped identify what had existed in the original cut. Some recovered footage had deteriorated significantly and required frame-by-frame stabilization and color correction before it could be reintegrated. What emerged from years of this painstaking work was not a perfect reconstruction, but a remarkably close one. Close enough that most of what had been lost to the 1963 cuts was recovered and reinstated. The process became a model for subsequent large-scale film restorations and demonstrated that even a production as well documented as this one could require the effort of a full archival investigation to be seen as intended. Preserving a film, it turned out, could be nearly as difficult as making one, and in some ways, just as creative. Number 25. Lost voices and missing scenes. The restoration recovered a great deal, but not everything. Among the most challenging obstacles facing the team were scenes in which the picture had survived, but the original audio had not. The sound elements for several sequences were either missing entirely or too damaged for conventional restoration to salvage. For a film in which silence and sound had been used with such deliberate precision, filling those gaps with reconstructed audio was a problem without a clean solution. The approach taken for the most significant of these scenes involved re-recording dialogue with the original actors where possible. Peter O'Toole and other surviving cast members returned to the studio decades after filming to loop lines for sequences they had performed in the Jordanian desert in the early 1960s. The process was technically complex, matching the acoustic environment of a studio recording to footage shot outdoors in extreme conditions. And the results, while impressive, are audible to careful listeners as a subtle disconnect between image and sound. It is a detail that speaks to something larger about the film's complicated survival. Lawrence of Arabia exists today in a form that is extraordinary by any reasonable measure, vast, detailed, and closer to its original vision than seemed possible when restoration began. But it is not entirely whole. Somewhere between the desert where it was filmed and the present day, small pieces were lost that no amount of effort could fully recover. What remains is a masterpiece, and a reminder that even the greatest films carry within them something irretrievably gone. Some stories, it seems, can never be fully told. Lawrence of Arabia was never just a film about one man crossing a desert. It was a production that crossed every limit its makers set for themselves, surviving damaged prints, flooded locations, impossible logistics, and decades of archival neglect to reach audiences in something close to its intended form. Every secret explored in this video is proof that what appears effortless on screen was, behind the camera, anything but. What makes its legacy remarkable is not just the 7 Oscars, the iconic score, or the images that defined an era of epic filmmaking. It is the sheer accumulation of near disasters, creative gambles, and human endurance that the finished picture quietly contains. The desert left its mark on the film stock, on the cast, and on everyone who gave years of their lives to bring it to the screen. If this deep dive into one of cinema's greatest productions gave you something new to think about, hit like and subscribe so you never miss another one. And drop a comment below. Which of these hidden secrets surprised you the most?